Welcome to our journey across rural Missouri and one of the most unsettling cases in history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. In the summer of 1922, the town of Millbrook, Missouri, was regarded as an ordinary place. Situated on the banks of the Osage River about 20 miles southwest of Jefferson City, it had a population of just over 600. With its undulating hills, thick groves of oak and hickory, and farmland stretching to the horizon, the area was of little note except for the occasional reference in county agricultural reports, and the small riverboat dock that functioned as a little trading post. There wasn't much that set the small town apart from the many others scattered across Missouri, and visitors rarely remained more than one night at the Millbrook Inn. Thomas Mercer, the town postmaster, made an odd observation here on the 14th of June, 1922. For 17 days, Eliza Blackwood, a widow whose farmhouse was remote on the outskirts of Grimshaw Woods, had not picked up her mail. If it weren't for the fact that Mrs. Blackwood had consistently retrieved her correspondence every Wednesday morning at exactly 9:30 for the 30 years since her husband's death, this detail could have seemed unimportant. Mercer later testified that Mrs. Blackwood was so reliable that other customers frequently compared her arrival time to their pocket watches. She was more reliable than the church bells, Mercer would subsequently confess to investigators. Even during the 1918 influenza epidemic, when half the town was bedridden, Mrs. Blackwood kept to her routine, adding the precaution of wearing a gauze mask while she went about her business. Rain or shine, cold or heat, Wednesdays at 9:30, Mrs. Blackwood would appear at the counter, dressed in black, her posture perfect, requesting her mail with the same formal phrase, "Good morning, Mr. Mercer. I believe there may be correspondence for the Blackwood residence," the postmaster wrote. The postmaster brought up this interest with Sheriff Edmund Holcomb, who at first brushed it off. He is supposed to have stated, "Eliza keeps to herself, always has." The sheriff, a practical man who had been in office for almost 15 years, was notorious for not getting involved in what he called neighborly worries. While he had jurisdiction over Millbrook and 3 nearby townships, he preferred to concentrate his meager resources on crimes that could be proven to have occurred rather than unexplained absences, especially when the absentee was an elderly widow with a history of reclusiveness. However, the sheriff's casual rejection turned into official worry 3 days later when Reverend William Porter reported that Mrs. Blackwood had skipped Sunday worship for the first time in 30 years. The Reverend, who had served at the Millbrook Presbyterian Church since before the year 2000, described Mrs. Blackwood as a regular member of the congregation, but one who rarely interacted with other members of the congregation. She had been going to church every Sunday since April 24, 1892, the Sunday after her husband's funeral, according to church records. She arrived exactly 5 minutes before the ceremony started and left right after the benediction, always sitting in the same pew, third from the back on the left. Few people would discuss what the authorities found at the Blackwood farmhouse on that warm June afternoon, but it would haunt Millbrook for centuries to come. According to the Missouri Historical Society's later classification of the discovery as administratively restricted until its partial declassification in 1963, the circumstances surrounding it, as revealed by fragmented police reports and private correspondence between county officials, defy conventional explanation. The Blackwood farm was unusually quiet when Sheriff Holcomb and Deputy James Winters arrived there that Thursday afternoon. The farmhouse looked undisturbed, a 2-story building constructed of local timber and limestone in the 1872. The windows were covered and the front entrance locked. The porch railing was covered with a coating of undisturbed dust. Summer squash, tomatoes, and green beans were growing in neat rows in the vegetable garden at the side of the house, which was clearly recently tended. In a tiny coop behind the home, chickens roamed around freely, looking healthy and fed. The officers walked around the property before choosing to enter through the kitchen door, which they discovered to be unlocked, according to the official report submitted on the 18th of June, 1922. The house's interior was kept up with great care. Dishes were cleaned and placed in the cabinet with mathematical accuracy. Floors were swept, and furniture was dusted. Sitting on the chilly burner was a pot of stew that was only protected from the summer heat by the generous amount of salt that had been added. One was seated at the table. In his report, Deputy Winters observed that the house felt more like a museum than a home because of its overwhelming sense of orderliness. From the row of 4 similar black outfits hanging in the wardrobe to the 6 spoons in the silver drawer, every of the items seemed to have a certain position. The cut ends of the firewood next to the stove had even been placed facing the same way, but there was no sign of Eliza Blackwood. The next step was a comprehensive search of the entire property, starting with the top floor and proceeding down. The bed was made with hospital corners, and the master bedroom looked undisturbed. The closet was filled with Mrs. Blackwood's clothes, sorted by category and color. On the nightstand, next to a battered edition of Wuthering Heights, with a faded ribbon indicating her position on page 117, were her reading glasses. Nothing pointed to a hurried departure. There were a few gray hairs in the hairbrush on the vanity. A basin and pottery pitcher were set up for morning ablutions. Sheriff Holcomb observed an oddity in the layout of the chamber. A single wooden chair had been put in the corner, directly opposite the door, facing into the room instead of a window or mirror, while the bed, vanity, and wardrobe were arranged in the traditional manner. Despite its apparent lack of use, the chair had obvious marks of frequent use. The floorboards underneath the seat were more faded than the wood around it, and the seat itself was smooth from wear. A temple to childhood preserved in time, the second bedroom had not been used since the Blackwoods' only son died during the 1889 influenza outbreak. A wooden rocking horse, with undamaged but worn paint, faced the window. On a dresser, a small group of tin soldiers stood in exact rows, ready for action. The pillow was fluffed, as if anticipating its occupant's return from an afternoon of play. The bed was made. A child's jacket, initialed J.B., for James Blackwood, who had passed away at the age of 7, was hanging on a wall hook, a cotton handkerchief remaining in its pocket. The preserved room was unnerving to Deputy Winters, a younger guy who had just started working for the sheriff's office. He wrote in his private notes, which were later given to the County Historical Society, "There is something unnatural about such perfect preservation. Dust should settle. Fabrics should fade. Time should leave its mark." Yet the boy's room appears suspended in a moment 33 years past, as though the hours there refused to advance after young James drew his last breath. Only when the officers went down to the cellar did the neat story of the Blackwood mansion start to fall apart. Unlike all the other doors in the immaculately kept house, the cellar door was locked with 3 different padlocks of different brands. After a thorough search, the officers were unable to locate the keys and had to tear the door off its hinges. The cellar itself was unremarkable. Shelves stocked with preserved fruits and vegetables, a dirt floor, and stone walls. In neat rows stood jars of pickled fruits and vegetables, each labeled with the date and contents in Mrs. Blackwood's exact handwriting. There was enough fuel for several winter months in a tiny coal bin. Despite their practical use, the farm tools, a shovel, a rake, and a hoe that were suspended from hooks on the wall were all spotless. However, they found another door in the northeast corner, partially hidden under a rack of wine bottles, which was not listed on the property's architectural plan or county records. The dark wood used to make the door didn't match any of the other woodwork in the house. Its hinges gave the impression that it had been added years after the house was first built, because they were made of hand-forged iron rather than the manufactured hardware found elsewhere. There was no lock on this second door. The smallest touch caused it to swing open, revealing an 8-foot square room. The floor was compacted soil, and the walls were bare stone. One oil lamp was suspended from a ceiling hook, and there was a plain wooden desk in the middle of the space. There was a leather-bound diary on that desk. Sheriff Holcomb reported that the diary included daily entries from April 17, 1892, the day following the funeral of Elijah Blackwood, until June 11, 1922, 3 days prior to the postal noting Mrs. Blackwood's departure. 30 years of daily record-keeping in a careful, exacting hand that never faltered, not even in the last entries. The book itself was unique. There was no manufacturer's stamp or name on the leather binding, and the paper was of a texture and quality uncommon in rural Missouri at the time. After reading just a few pages, Sheriff Holcomb called the county prosecutor right away, who then alerted the Missouri State Police. The property was surrounded by a perimeter by sundown, and police officers kept watch all night. Detective Lawrence Sullivan of the State Police came from Jefferson City the next morning to assume command of the investigation. Everything the residents of Millbrook believed to be true about the calm widow who lived on the outskirts of Grimshaw Woods would be called into question by what those pages held. After reading the contents, the Missouri State Police expanded the investigation outside of the county and sealed the diary as evidence right away. The case had been taken over by state authorities by July 1922, and all local officials were told to stop discussing it in public, until Dr. Margaret Caldwell, a historian at Washington University in St. Louis, successfully petitioned for access to the diary's contents for scholarly purposes in 1963. Its contents were classified. In 1965, Caldwell published his second monograph, Shadows of Millbrook, The Eliza Blackwood Case Reconsidered, which is now long out of print, but offers the most thorough account of what happened in that remote home. The publisher declined to create a second edition after Dr. Caldwell's untimely death in 1969, and just 1,000 copies were made. The diary's early entries depicted a state of intense mourning. After her husband died of heart failure, Eliza Blackwood wrote about the void in her life. She told how she spent hours wearing his coat, sitting in his chair, and attempting to keep his aroma from fading off the fabric. She described having discussions with his portrait, arranging his place at dinner, and spending the night on his side of the bed till morning. Even if they might be over the top, these actions are not unusual in situations involving severe loss, especially in a time before official grief therapy. On the 29th of April 1892, she wrote, "I heard Elijah in the hallway today. His footsteps are unmistakable, the slight drag of the left foot from where he broke it, falling from the barn roof in '83. I called to him, but he did not answer. When I went to look, the hallway was empty, but I know what I heard." For several months, the Post kept up this theme, with a widow's grief showing up as imagined sounds, glimpses, and feelings of her late husband's presence. Even while they may be rare, such experiences are not unheard of among those who have experienced severe loss. However, the Post's tone started to change in 1892 as summer gave way to fall. On the 8th of September 1892, Mrs. Blackwood wrote, "Elijah is watching me. Not the Elijah who lived and breathed and slept beside me for 26 years. Something else. Something that wears his face, but cannot quite manage his smile. It stands in corners. It sits at the foot of the bed. It follows 3 steps behind me in the garden. It does not speak. It only watches." The entries had become darker by winter. Eliza started recording what she called visitations, which were incidents that occurred during the night when she allegedly woke up to discover a figure standing above her bed. Over time, this figure's description changed, becoming more specific and less like the person Elijah Blackwood had been in real life. On the 21st of December, 1892, she wrote, "It no longer pretends to be Elijah. It has abandoned that mask. What stands in my room at night is something older. Something that has always lived in the shadows of Grimshaw Woods. Something that found its way into my Elijah before his heart gave out, and now has found its way to me." Throughout 1893 and 1894, the frequency of these nighttime visits increased. Mrs. Blackwood started napping during the day and compelled herself to stay awake at night, recording her observations. Although she detailed talks with the entity, it is noteworthy that she never once recorded the creature speaking in her thousands of pages of paperwork. If there was any communication at all, it seems to have been completely one-sided or possibly nonverbal. It communicates through impressions, not words. One record dated February 3, 1894, states, "Images that form in the mind, sensations that bloom in the chest, knowledge that simply appears fully formed, as though I had always known it, but somehow forgotten until this moment. Tonight it showed me the inside of Grimshaw Woods, not as they appear to human eyes, but as they truly are. The trees have veins, the soil breathes, and beneath it all, something waits, patient as stone. The journal entries began to exhibit a new pattern by the fall of 1894. Mrs. Blackwood started writing down what she referred to as the offerings, small objects that she would place in her bedroom's corner after dusk. These were first symbolic mementos, such as a pressed flower from her husband's tomb, a lock of her hair, or a drop of blood from a pricked finger. She meticulously recorded every offering, noting when it was made, how it was received, and how it was handled the next morning. On the 3rd of October 1894, she wrote, "It accepts my offerings. When I wake, they are gone. In return, it has granted me a boon. I can feel Elijah again, not as the hollow thing that watched me, but as he was. His thoughts flow through me, his memories. There are gaps still, places I cannot reach, but this is progress." There was a notable increase during the winter of 1894-1895. The secret room in the cellar, a space where the veil is thinnest, as Mrs. Blackwood phrased it, was built. Over the course of several weeks, she labored alone and covertly, mixing mortar by moonlight and transporting stones from the river. In her analysis, Dr. Caldwell points out the concerning coincidence that on January 1st, 1895, a local farmer reported the disappearance of several chickens and a prize sow. The room was finished on December 31st, 1894, and consecrated, her word, with what she described as only a sacrifice worthy of the threshold. The diary entries give the report a potentially more troubling relevance. Even though local authorities rejected it as a case of theft or predation, the diary entries after the secret room is finished become increasingly disjointed, less focused on everyday details, and more centered on Mrs. Blackwood's developing comprehension of what she has allowed into her house. She started writing down what she claimed to be Elijah's memories, older memories dating back decades, or even centuries before his birth, rather than the memories of the man she had known. "Today, I remembered the taste of water from a well that was filled in 100 years ago," one record dated February 17th, 1895 states. "I remembered watching this land when the only structures upon it were the temporary lodges of people whose names have been forgotten. I remembered the satisfaction of being feared, and how that fear tasted when it caught in the back of a throat." Mrs. Blackwood recorded a series of tests carried out in the secret subterranean chamber during the spring and summer of 1895. She described trying to direct or channel whatever presence she thought she had reached. "The writings from this time period are especially jumbled, with paragraphs written in what seems to be a personal cipher that Dr. Caldwell was never able to fully decipher, sketches of unknown symbols, and bits and pieces of poetry." A partially deciphered passage from May 11th, 1895. "The boundary between self and other grows permeable. Yesterday I found myself standing at the edge of Grimshaw Pond, though I have no memory of walking there. My shoes were muddy, my hands cold. In my pocket, a smooth stone I do not recall collecting. When I returned home, 3 hours had passed, though it felt like moments. It wants something from the pond. Something buried in the silt at its center, something that has waited a very long time." By fall, the diary revealed a new development. Mrs. Blackwood started documenting conversations with her neighbors that happened off her property. She spoke of having the ability to see beneath their skin and taste their secrets. She was especially interested in the hidden anxieties and shames of notable Millbrook residents, such as the mayor's embezzlement from the town treasury, the doctor's dependence on laudanum, and the reverend's crisis of faith. On the 9th of November, 1895, she wrote, "They look at me differently now. They sense something has changed, though they cannot name it. Their discomfort is palpable. Delicious. When I passed Mrs. Allister on the street today, she crossed herself, when she thought I wasn't looking. She is right to do so. The 1,896 entries adopt a more systematic approach. Mrs. Blackwood started recording what she referred to as the collection, a list of objects obtained from the locals under a variety of guises: a handkerchief that was borrowed but never returned, a hairbrush that was abandoned following an infrequent social call, or a child's abandoned toy discovered on the side of the road. Every object was thoroughly explained, including who owned it and how she obtained it. On the 23rd of April 1896, she wrote, "Acquired a fountain pen belonging to Judge Harmon today. He left it on the counter at the general store. I commented on its quality, and he, perhaps taken aback by my unexpected sociability, allowed me to examine it. When he turned to pay for his purchase, I tucked it into my sleeve. A small theft. He will attribute it to carelessness and purchase another. But the pen wrote his decisions, signed his orders. His authority flows through the metal nib. It will serve us well." According to later entries, these objects were brought to the secret chamber and incorporated into what she called the work. The precise nature of this work was never made clear, frequently being described in the cipher noted above or through indirect allusions that are difficult to understand. There are multiple unsuccessful attempts to decode these paragraphs in Dr. Caldwell's monograph. The diary makes it abundantly evident that by 1897, Eliza Blackwood had developed a routine that would seldom change over the following 25 years. She continued to present herself to the public as the prim, quiet widow. She went to church. At the general store, she made small talk. She kept up her property and paid her taxes. The increasingly complex routines she recorded in her diary would have been completely unrelated to her public behavior. The journal's middle years, which roughly span 1,897 to 1,917, exhibit a cyclical structure. Mrs. Blackwood explained periods of gathering, when she collected objects from unaware villagers; preparation, when she performed rituals in the secret room; and communion, when she said she was given information or experiences that were not her own. The most important activities took place around the solstices and equinoxes, and these cycles roughly matched the seasons. She kept thorough records of the town of Millbrooks and its residents' changes during this time. She kept track of marriages, divorces, births, and deaths, frequently foretelling these occasions days or weeks in advance. She kept track of diseases that spread around the neighborhood, occasionally identifying those who would get sick before exhibiting any signs. She meticulously documented government appointments, property transfers, and business bankruptcies. On the 17th of March, 1901, she wrote, "William Carpenter's mill will burn before the month ends. The main drive wheel is improperly aligned and creates friction against the housing. A spark will catch in the sawdust. 2 will not escape. It is necessary. The confluence requires it." The entries that match recorded disasters in Millbrook's past are especially unsettling. Mrs. Blackwood wrote the above passage 3 days before a fire destroyed the Millbrook Mill in 1901, killing 2 workers. "The small birds will fall from the nest, one after another, while the mother watches helplessly. Their breath will fade. Their light will diminish. The pattern requires completion," she wrote. A week before, the Craver family lost 3 children to diphtheria in 1904. One of the most troubling unresolved issues in the Blackwood case is whether these were actually predictive or just the recording of intended activities. In her study, Dr. Caldwell points out that there isn't any concrete proof that Mrs. Blackwood committed any crimes. Mechanical failure was cited as the cause of the mill fire. Many households in the area were impacted by the diphtheria outbreak. However, the journal entries' detail and chronology create unsettling possibilities that cannot be completely ruled out. According to Mrs. Blackwood's records, she had become somewhat integrated with whatever spirit she thought lived in her house by 1905. She alternately used the pronouns I and we, sometimes in the same paragraph. She talked about physical changes, such as increased sensory perception, changed taste preferences, and light sensitivity. Above all, she started recording what she referred to as excursions times, usually at night, when she would go around Millbrook and the surrounding countryside, seeing without being watched. On the 3rd of September, 1905, one entry reads, "Stood outside the Henderson home for 2 hours last night. They never drew the kitchen curtain. Watched them eat, argue, reconcile. The child cried over spilled milk. The father comforted while the mother cleaned. Such ordinary moments filled with such potential. They never sensed our presence, though the dog whined and scratched at the door. We could have reached through the glass, touched them, taken something small but essential. But the time is not yet right. We are still becoming." The diary began to regularly include these nighttime observations. Without the subject's knowledge, Mrs. Blackwood recorded hundreds of private moments in dozens of families. She told of following people on private errands across fields or woods, listening to private talks via open windows, and standing in bedrooms while residents slept. She never talks about having direct contact with the people she watched in these tales. According to her own account, she continued to be a silent witness, present but unnoticed. These entries, however, rank among the diary's most unsettling ones, implying a degree of invasion and surveillance that went unnoticed for years. Between 1908 and 1914, there was a growing interest in the idea of thinning, which was Mrs. Blackwood's term for times or places where she thought the lines separating worlds grew more pliable. A lightning-stricken oak in Grimshaw Woods, a certain bend in the Osage River, the northeast corner of the Presbyterian Cemetery, and most importantly, the secret room in her cellar were among the locations she identified as being especially favorable to this phenomena in the Millbrook area. On the 9th of April 1910, she wrote, "The thinning progresses. Yesterday, sitting in the special room, I became aware of a moment when the stone walls seemed to breathe. The air grew dense, then rarefied. For 7 heartbeats I could see through the earth itself, the worms turning, the roots stretching, the hidden water moving through channels carved before human feet ever walked this continent. And beneath it all, the deeper presence, the patient watcher, extending tendrils upward, seeking connection. I extended my hand into the stone wall and felt no resistance. When I withdrew it, soil clung to my fingers, though the wall remained solid." The diary's tone noticeably changes in 1914, the year that World War I breaks out. Mrs. Blackwood, who hardly ever spoke about anything outside of Millbrook, started recording how she saw the far-off war. Since of the scant information accessible in rural Missouri at the time, these notes are especially disturbing since they imply a level of knowing that would not have been conceivable. On the 26th of August, 1914, she wrote, "The fields of Belgium are soaked through. Men drown in mud, while others walk across their backs. Metal rains from the sky. The old powers feed well on such abundant offerings, though they did not orchestrate this particular feast. Human ingenuity requires little supernatural encouragement when it comes to devising new methods of destruction." Mrs. Blackwood's entries during the war years vary between these more general observations on the European War and her in-depth observations of Millbrook. Days before the news reached American newspapers, she reported about specific battles. She detailed tactics and armaments that would not be made public until years after the end of the conflict. With clinical accuracy, she described the psychological effects of trench combat, as if she were witnessing the decline of men's minds under continual barrage. In her investigation, Dr. Caldwell examines a number of potential reasons for this apparent foreign knowledge, ranging from chance and good fortune to the potential that Mrs. Blackwood had access to information sources that other Millbrook residents did not. Nevertheless, she reluctantly comes to the conclusion that the detail and correctness of the entries cannot be sufficiently explained by any of these traditional theories. Another noteworthy time in the diary is the 1918 influenza epidemic. Long before the disease ever made it to Millbrook, Mrs. Blackwood wrote about its approach, calling it a tidal wave of exhalation moving across continents. When the illness finally hit the town in October of that year, she meticulously documented its course, noting which households would be impacted and forecasting which victims would recover and which would die. On the 17th of October, 1918, she wrote, "7 will die before All Hallows. The Mercer child will seem to recover, then fade in the night. The Wilson twins will go together, within hours of each other. Pastor Porter will sacrifice himself, tending to his flock, and join them in the ground. His replacement will bring changes to the congregation, some necessary, some merely disruptive. The pattern adjusts to accommodate these alterations." Town records show that all of these forecasts came true. She revealed how the deaths happened. In fact, the younger Street, Louis Mann, who succeeded Reverend Porter, made major modifications to the church's procedures, which caused a small split within the community the next year. Despite her old age and continuous involvement in community activities, Mrs. Blackwood herself was unaffected by the epidemic during this time of collective sorrow. Her altered nature and the protective influence of the presence she had developed in her home were cited in the journal as the reasons for her immunity. There is a noticeable change in tone throughout the diary's last 5 years. From 1917 to 1922. Mrs. Blackwood started writing shorter, more straightforward entries that were less embellished with ciphers or metaphors. She frequently used the words completion and culmination. She described the entity, whom she by now simply called Elijah, despite the fact that it obviously didn't look much like her late husband, as impatient and hungry for conclusion. On the 1st of January, 1920, she wrote, 30 years approaches. The agreement made in grief and desperation will soon require fulfillment. The circle tightens, the boundary thins. What was two becomes one. What was forgotten will be remembered. What was lost will be found, though not in the form expected. The notes in 1921 and early 1922 become more and more concerned with getting ready for what Mrs. Blackwood called the transition. She recorded the slow selling of personal belongings, the settling of financial matters, and the careful arrangement of household objects. She described having last talks at her husband's and son's graves. She wrote goodbyes to locations in and around Millbrook that had been important to her throughout her life, but she said that these farewells were silent and private, with little sign to outsiders that she was doing anything to bring herself to closure. On the 16th of April 1922, she wrote, 30 years today since Elijah was committed to the earth, 30 years of patience, 30 years of preparation. The symmetry is elegant. The circle nearly complete. When the moment arrives, there will be no hesitation, no regret. What was promised will be fulfilled. What was separate will be unified. The door between worlds will open, and I will step through, transformed. In the May 1922 entries, Mrs. Blackwood outlined particular items to be gathered, arrangements to be made, and words to be spoken for what she called the final work. Many of these instructions are written in a cipher that has been difficult to fully translate. But the parts that have been deciphered point to a complex ceremony that involves items gathered over 30 years and arranged in accordance with exact astronomical alignments. In its entirety, the penultimate entry, dated June 10th, 1922, reads, "Tomorrow it ends. Tomorrow it begins. The circle closes. Elijah will have what he has waited for, and I will have what I was promised. 30 years of preparation, 30 years of patience, one final offering." The diary ends with the final entry, dated June 11th, 1922, which is just 5 words long. The door is finally open. The book had enough blank leaves for several more years of documentation, but no more pages were used. After the diary was located, investigators searched the Blackwood home further, but they were unable to locate Eliza Blackwood. She was still dressed. There was no damage to her personal belongings. There was no indication that she had prepared a trip or packed her possessions. She had just disappeared, leaving behind a paper that left many more questions than it answered, and a house that seemed to have been frozen in time. Beyond the property, the nearby farms and woods were also the subject of the study. Despite being transported from Jefferson City, tracker dogs were unable to locate any scent trails emanating from the house. Nothing noteworthy was found when the Osage River was pulled from the property border for a quarter of a mile in each direction. Searches of wells and abandoned mine shafts across the county yielded no results. Detective Sullivan, in his official report dated July 7, 19, stated, "The absence of Mrs. Blackwood presents a singular problem in that there exists no evidence of departure, no indication of force, and no trace of remains. It is as though the subject simply ceased to exist at a specific moment, leaving her environment utterly undisturbed. In my 17 years of investigative work, I have encountered no comparable case." Residents of Millbrook who were interviewed described how Eliza Blackwood had always been seen by the community with a mix of respect and anxiety. The majority characterized her as consistently courteous but aloof. Many mentioned that they had started to deliberately avoid her in recent years, but when asked why, they were unable to provide a clear explanation. According to Reverend Porter, during Sunday services, other members of the congregation would slowly migrate in their pews until Mrs. Blackwood was sitting by herself. However, the movement was so subtle that it seemed to be unconscious on the part of her neighbors. One statement from Martha Gaines, who had run the general store since 1910, was especially instructive. Mrs. Blackwood always paid in exact change, never a penny more or less. Her shopping list never varied, the same items in the same quantities on the same days of the month. She would wait until the store was empty before approaching the counter. She never touched another customer, not even accidentally. And her eyes. I know this sounds foolish, but her eyes seemed to change color depending on the light. Sometimes gray, sometimes so dark they appeared black. In the last year or so, I found myself holding my breath whenever she was in the store, only exhaling when the door closed behind her. I have no rational explanation for this response. The evidence of Dr. James Whitfield, who had been Millbrook's doctor since 1897, was arguably the most instructive. He remembered being summoned to the Blackwood house during the pandemic that ravaged the area in the winter of 1918 when Mrs. Blackwood was ill with influenza. He recalled going into her bedroom to find her babbling unintelligibly and burning with heat. In his deposition, Dr. Whitfield said, "I've treated hundreds of fever patients. They often speak nonsense or call out for loved ones. But what Mrs. Blackwood was saying, it wasn't delirium in any usual sense. She was carrying on what sounded like one side of a conversation, responding to questions I couldn't hear, agreeing to terms that weren't being offered. When I touched her wrist to take her pulse, her skin was cold, despite the fever. Not cool, cold, like something left out in January. And she looked at me with a recognition, not as her doctor, but as though she knew something intimate about me, something shameful. I completed my examination as quickly as possible and did not return, sending my nurse instead for follow-up visits. Mrs. Blackwood recovered with remarkable speed, faster than any other patient I treated during the outbreak. By the time my nurse made her third visit, the widow was up and about as though she had never been ill. In his supplemental report, Sheriff Holcomb mentioned that he felt uneasy while searching the Blackwood house. "There was a quality to the silence in that house unlike anything I have experienced," he stated in his letter. Not the absence of sound, but something more deliberate, as though the space itself was listening. The hidden room in the cellar affected all who entered it similarly. A pressure behind the eyes, a ringing in the ears, a sense of being observed from all sides simultaneously. Deputy Winters refused to enter the room a second time, claiming he felt something moving just at the edge of vision. I dismissed this as imagination at the time, but I cannot deny experiencing a profound relief upon concluding our investigation and leaving the property. The investigation had come to a standstill by August 1922. There was no body discovered. It was impossible to prove foul play. There had been no reports of Mrs. Blackwood's presence in nearby areas. The case, which was categorized as an unexplained disappearance, was still open, but inactive. In anticipation of the potential appearance of legal successors, the Blackwood property was secured, but otherwise left unaltered. That year, in October, there was one last odd development. A parcel addressed to the head archivist arrived at the Missouri Historical Society's St. Louis office. It included a number of Elijah Blackwood's personal belongings that were not in the farmhouse when the search was conducted. Among these were a pocket watch that had been handed down through his family's generations and his wedding ring, which was purportedly buried with him in 1892. A daguerreotype image of the Blackwood family, shot in 1888, was also included. It showed Elijah, Eliza, and their young son James standing rigidly in front of their farmhouse. One piece of paper, however, folded over the wedding band, was the most unsettling object. The circle is complete. What was divided is now whole. Do not look for me in places where time still moves forward. Mrs. Blackwood's distinctive handwriting was on it, and the parcel had no return address. It was mailed from Omaha, Nebraska, according to the postmark. Analysis of the handwriting revealed that Eliza Blackwood had written the address. If it can be termed that, this was the final exchange of messages in the Blackwood case. No other proof surfaced. There was never a definitive explanation. Dr. Caldwell presents 3 possible readings of the journal and the events it records in her 1965 monograph. The first is that after her husband passed away, Eliza Blackwood developed a complicated delusional condition, a grief-induced psychosis that developed over decades into a sophisticated set of rituals and beliefs. This theory suggests that Mrs. Blackwood most likely died accidentally during a delusional episode, possibly falling into the Osage River outside the search area or becoming lost in Grimshaw Woods. Therefore, rather than being a supernatural event, the diary would be the record of a slowly failing mind. An accomplice or unintentional assistant would have prepared the package ahead of time and mailed it to the Historical Society. Second, Mrs. Blackwood was a patient, cunning killer rather than someone suffering from a mental illness. According to Dr. Caldwell, there were a number of mysterious deaths in Millbrook from 1892 to 1922 that were ascribed to natural causes, yet happened soon after the journal mentions the deceased. According to this idea, Mrs. Blackwood's disappearance was a meticulously orchestrated escape after she became worried that suspicions were growing, and the supernatural aspects of the diary were a front used to hide premeditated murders. The package would have been sent as a last-ditch challenge to the authorities, proving that she could enter purportedly restricted areas undetected. The diary records precisely what it purports to: a 30-year communion with something non-human that ended in a metamorphosis or transition that left no physical trace of Eliza Blackwood in our world. This is the third interpretation, which Dr. Caldwell includes for the sake of thorough analysis, but obviously finds least credible. According to this interpretation, the package signifies the ultimate breaking of connections with the world of humans, the discarding of things that were no longer required in whatever condition or location Mrs. Blackwood was in at the time. The facts, as they have been reported, are nonetheless unsettling, regardless of the truth. For 30 years, a woman lived alone in a remote farmhouse. She meticulously documented ever more weird ideas, convictions, and behaviors. Then, one June day in 1922, she disappeared, leaving behind just doubts that have persisted over the years. After Eliza vanished, the Blackwood farmhouse was deserted for 11 years. The property subsequently returned to the county for unpaid taxes, since there were no heirs to claim it. Harold Jenkins, an Illinois farmer searching for less expensive land, purchased the property from the county in 1933, at the height of the Great Depression. The Jenkins family lived in the residence for less than a month. They departed suddenly, leaving behind the majority of their possessions. Harold Jenkins would only respond that the house didn't want us there when questioned years later with no further explanation. During a separate interview for a 1951 local newspaper article, his wife stated that their 6-year-old daughter had frequently mentioned the lady who stands in corners and watches. From 1933 to 1957, 4 more families tried to occupy the residence. Not a single one lasted more than 8 months. Among the complaints were unexplained cold spots, recurring noises, and, in one particularly memorable case, discovering all of the furniture in the house upside down in the middle of the night, despite the windows and doors being locked. In a 1956 letter to the County Historical Society, Thomas Burroughs, the last person to try to live in the house, gave a thorough description of his experience. "We lasted longer than most, nearly 7 months," he stated. "The disturbances began subtly. Items misplaced, cold patches in rooms, regardless of how high we stoked the fire. The sensation of being watched, particularly in the main bedroom. My wife insisted on moving our bed 3 times, trying to find a position where she didn't feel observed during the night. The cellar was worst. We used it only for storage, never spending more time down there than absolutely necessary. The northeast corner, where, according to local gossip, there had once been another room, felt wrong somehow. The air seemed thicker there. Sounds were muffled. Time itself seemed to move differently. I once went down to retrieve a preserved ham and found myself still standing there 2 hours later, though I would have sworn only minutes had passed. What finally drove us out was finding writing on the walls. Not graffiti or vandalism, the house was always locked, and we had no visitors. But one morning we woke to find a sentence written in pencil on the dining room wall. The circle remains open. The handwriting matched none of ours. We left that day, taking only what we could carry. The building was destroyed by an unidentified fire in 1957. The house was reduced to a stone foundation and smoking timbers by the time fire departments from Millbrook and nearby communities arrived. Surprisingly, beneath the wreckage, part of the cellar, including the space where the secret room had been, was still there. The volunteer fire chief for Millbrook at the time, Frank Doyle, later called the fire unnatural in his official report. Doyle stated that there was no indication of an electrical malfunction or accelerants, and the fire seemed to have started simultaneously in several places throughout the house. The behavior of the fire was much more strange. Despite the fire's strength, witnesses reported that it produced virtually little smoke and that the flames were blazing with an odd purple tint. After the foundation was eventually filled in, the land has remained unoccupied for the time being, having gone through several owners who either bought it as an investment or with unfulfilled construction plans. Local kids challenge one another to spend the night there, but very few actually do, and those that do usually come back looking pale and not wanting to talk about it. A team from the University of Missouri Archaeological Research Center surveyed previously submerged sections of the Osage River banks close to the former Blackwood property in 1968, during a particularly bad drought. They found a little wooden box among the exposed sediments, with a covering of wax protecting its contents from water damage. There was only one sheet of paper in the box. Unmistakably, the handwriting matched the Blackwood Journal. One day after the last diary entry, on June 12, 1922, the message said, "I have become what waits in the corners of your vision." The archaeological team's leader, Dr. Simon Eastlake, wrote in his field journal that the survey had an unprecedented run of bad luck after the finding. Equipment malfunctioned without warning. 2 members of the team experienced severe, inexplicable rashes. Rapid deterioration of the weather forced an early project end. Dr. Eastlake himself claimed to have had intense nightmares in which he was wandering around a deserted house and conscious that he was being watched from every angle, even though he couldn't see anyone watching. Only researchers with special permission can access the original diary, which is still kept in the Missouri Historical Society's guarded archives. Once regarded as arcane academic study, Dr. Caldwell's monograph has recently gained popularity among true crime literature collectors, with surviving first editions fetching prices as high as $2,000. The case still holds a peculiar appeal for people who come upon it, more than a century after Eliza Blackwood vanished. Periodically, newspaper articles spark curiosity. The complete truth is still hidden beneath layers of time, conjecture, and maybe intentional obscuration, despite occasional attempts by amateur detectives to unravel the enigma. There is still no conclusive explanation for the case of Eliza Blackwood, the diligent widow who chronicled her own decline into either wickedness, madness, or something beyond the realm of common sense. A diary full of implausible claims, a mansion that refused to take residents, a woman who disappeared without a trace, and a persistent uneasiness that descends upon everyone who digs too far into the narrative are all that are left. The testimony of Dr. Caldwell herself, which was recorded just before her death in 1969, is arguably the most unsettling of all. After years of studying the Blackwood case, after reading every page of that diary multiple times, after interviewing dozens of Millbrook residents and descendants, she made a final troubling observation. In 30 years of historical research, I have never encountered a document that affected me the way the Blackwood Diary has. There is something in those pages, something in the particular arrangement of words and the progression of entries, in the cumulative effect of reading them in sequence, that alters one's perception. I find myself looking over my shoulder at movements I can't quite catch. I find myself avoiding corners and darkened doorways. I find myself waking at precisely 3:17 each morning. The time Mrs. Blackwood recorded her most significant communions. And most disturbing of all, I find myself understanding with increasing clarity exactly what she was attempting to accomplish. God help me. But there are moments, I believe, she succeeded. 3 weeks after saying this, Dr. Caldwell had a deadly stroke. Although there were indications that her office had been thoroughly searched, her notes for a planned second volume on the Blackwood case were never located. Ash was discovered in the wastebasket by a cleaning lady, indicating that papers had been burned not long before Caldwell passed away. The actual town of Millbrook has become obscure. Residents gradually left after the renovated mill closed in 1971. The population had dropped to less than 200 by the 1980 census. Now it's only a sign on the state highway and a collection of dilapidated buildings. However, Grimshaw Woods is still there, silent and unaltered on the outskirts of the house that Eliza Blackwood once occupied. After dusk, locals still stay away from it. Its bounds are unusually devoid of wildlife, according to hunters. A woman dressed in Victorian attire is sometimes, very rarely, reported to have been spotted standing amid the woods at dusk, watching the lights of distant houses with hungry, waiting eyes. Several locals who lived close to the former Blackwood property recounted a strange occurrence in 1992, precisely 100 years after Elijah Blackwood's passing. Lights were seen moving through Grimshaw Woods in ways that witnesses described as intentional and ritualistic for 3 nights in a row. No signs of campers or trespassers were discovered during the local authorities' investigation. There were no evidence of human passage on the ground, even though it had just rained, which should have preserved footprints. The most thorough description was given by Ellen Montgomery, whose family farm was close to the woods. I've lived beside those woods my entire life. Nothing like this has ever happened before or since. The lights weren't like flashlights or lanterns. They had no visible source. They moved too smoothly to be carried by someone walking through underbrush, and the pattern they formed, what looked like a circle, then a 5-pointed star, then something more complex I couldn't identify. On the 3rd night, they converged at what I believe would have been the location of the old Blackwood house, then glowed intensely for perhaps 30 seconds, then winked out simultaneously. While the phenomenon was reported in local newspapers and briefly by the Jefferson City Police, it received little attention outside of the immediate area. However, some who were familiar with the Blackwood case pointed out the timing. It was the 70th anniversary of Eliza's disappearance, as well as the centennial of Elijah's death. For his doctoral dissertation, Richard Harmon, a folklore graduate student at the University of Missouri, made an effort to track down and speak with every living person who was directly involved in or knowledgeable about the Blackwood case in 1996. He found Judith Winters, daughter of Deputy James Winters, who had been involved in the initial investigation, living in a Kansas City nursing facility as a result of his study. Miss Winters, who was 92 at the time but Harmon said was extremely coherent, related a narrative about the Blackwood investigation that her father had told her, but that had never been included in official reports or journalistic articles. She informed Harmon, "My father didn't talk much about the Blackwood case, but late in his life, when he knew he was dying, he shared something that had troubled him for decades." He said that during the search of the Blackwood property, while examining the hidden room in the cellar, Sheriff Holcomb discovered a small wooden box beneath a loose stone in the floor. Inside was a human finger bone, adult-sized, likely male, with a wedding band still encircling it. According to my father, the sheriff recognized the ring as matching the description of Elijah Blackwood's wedding band. Rather than complicating the investigation or distressing the community with the implication that Mrs. Blackwood might have disturbed her husband's grave, the sheriff quietly reburied the bone on the property and omitted it from his official report. My father believed this discovery cast the entire case in a different light. If Mrs. Blackwood had indeed taken a piece of her husband's remains, what else might she have done that remained undiscovered? He told me that after learning about the bone, he never again entered Grimshaw Woods, not even during daylight hours. By looking through Elijah Blackwood's burial records, Harmon tried to confirm this story, but discovered that the cemetery's pertinent area had been moved during a highway expansion in the 1952nd, and that Blackwood's grave had been among several others that had been moved. Nothing out of the ordinary about the remains state was mentioned in the exhumation and reinterment documents. In 1997, Harmon finished his dissertation, Whispers in Millbrook, The Cultural Legacy of the Blackwood Case, but it hasn't been published yet. He mentions in the acknowledgement section that he had unexpected technical challenges while conducting his research, including computer files becoming corrupted, tangible notes disappearing, and recording devices malfunctioning during case-related interviews. More concerning, he reports developing a persistent sense of being watched that led him to seek psychiatric treatment for what was diagnosed as transient paranoia. The dissertation concludes with a disturbing personal note. Having immersed myself in this case for 3 years, I find myself unable to reach a definitive conclusion about what happened to Eliza Blackwood. What I can say with certainty is that something about this story, this collection of facts, rumors, and speculations, affects those who study it too deeply. I have come to believe that there are some mysteries that actively resist illumination, not because the truth is hidden, but because the truth, once glimpsed, changes those who perceive it. I am completing this dissertation as a scholarly obligation, but I will pursue this subject no further. Some doors, once opened, cannot be easily closed again. Harmon abandoned academia shortly after completing his dissertation and, according to former colleagues, moved to Arizona where he deliberately disconnected from his previous research interests. For this account, attempts to get in touch with him failed. A strange thing happened to the Blackwood Diary in 2002 while the Missouri Historical Society was renovating its archives. The responsibility of moving the journal from its previous storage container to a new climate-controlled preservation box fell to a junior archivist called Michael Collins. According to internal reports that were ultimately made public through a Freedom of Information request, Collins, who had never heard of the Blackwood case before, described feeling a strange physical sensation like static electricity, but more persistent, coming from the diary when he handled it. More worrisome was his claim that he was unable to shut the diary for about 20 minutes after opening it momentarily to verify its condition, compulsively reading the entries even though he had been told not to look at the contents. Collins reported experiencing prolonged visual abnormalities, especially in his peripheral vision, and odd disorientation later that day. He didn't go back to work for 3 weeks after requesting sick leave the next morning. When he returned, he declined to talk about the incident further and asked to be transferred to a different department. 6 months later, he left the Historical Society. The diary was subject to limited access procedures after this incident. It is currently kept in a sealed container that can only be opened with dual authorization, and scholars who want to study it must present strong academic evidence and pass a psychological test both before and after access. The Blackwood document presents unique preservation challenges that necessitate restricted access protocols, said Dr. Eleanor Richards, current curator of special collections at the Missouri Historical Society, when asked about the diary's status. Beyond conservation concerns, we have found that prolonged exposure to the text can result in psychological distress in certain individuals, which is likely due to the disturbing nature of the content rather than any inherent quality of the object itself. But our primary responsibility is to ensure the well-being of both our collections and those who study them. When asked about specific incidents involving the diary, Dr. Richards declined to comment further, citing institutional policy and privacy concerns. When construction workers excavated what looked to be the remnants of a stone-lined underground chamber in 2008 while breaking ground for a new home complex next to the former Blackwood property, it was a potentially important discovery. A circular room about 12 feet in diameter with walls composed of river stones resembling those used to build the original Blackwood house was discovered during archaeological investigation. There were no important items or human remains in the chamber, which was about half a mile from the site of the house. But iron oxide pigment, also as red ochre, was applied to the inside walls in patterns that resembled some of the symbols drawn in the Blackwood diary. Experts determined that this pigment was what covered the walls. Eliza Blackwood lived in the area from 1890 to 1910, which is when the chamber was built, according to carbon dating of biological material discovered in the mortar between stones. Nevertheless, there is no mention of such a structure in any county records, and its function is still unknown. Dr. Catherine Mosley, the archaeologist who investigated the location and her findings, the chamber's construction indicates considerable effort and planning. The stones are fitted with remarkable precision, and the structure was clearly built to last. Whatever purpose it served, whether practical, ceremonial, or something else entirely, it represents a significant investment of time and labor by whoever created it. The fact that it remained undiscovered for nearly a century, despite being located in an area that has been periodically surveyed and developed, is itself remarkable. After the chamber was filled in and documented, work could begin. Due to financial difficulties brought on by the 2008 financial crisis, the home development was later shelved, and the property is still undeveloped today. An unexpected source in 2015 revealed a potentially important link to the Blackwood case. Archivists found admission records for a patient known simply as E.B., who was committed in 1883, 9 years before, to Elijah Blackwood's passing, while digitizing patient data from the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton. This facility was later renamed the Missouri State Mental Hospital. A 37-year-old woman was admitted by her husband for religious mania, unnatural fixations, and communication with imagined entities. According to the attending physician's notes, the patient claimed to have made contact with something ancient that lives in the woods, and that this entity had offered knowledge in exchange for service. Of particular interest is a quote ascribed to the code. Patient: it waits in corners and watches. It has always watched. It will wear the face of someone you trust, but you will know it by the eyes, which cannot disguise their hunger. The patient reportedly managed to escape the facility after only 3 months of confinement. Her husband said she had come home, apparently cured, and refused to have her recommitted, according to a brief note. In contrast, the initials E, B, and the overall time period coincide with Eliza Blackwood. There is not enough identifying information in the archives to prove this link. Since much of the documents from this era were destroyed in a fire that damaged a portion of the hospital's administration building in 1913, efforts to find more data have been fruitless. If these documents are actually about Eliza Blackwood, they raise questions about whether the unsettling ideas recorded in her diaries appeared years earlier than previously believed, and challenge the notion that they developed only in reaction to her husband's passing. Several scholars, reporters, and inquisitive people have tried to solve the mystery of Eliza Blackwood's fate over the years. Theories have been put forth that range from the commonplace she arranged her own disappearance to get out of an abusive relationship or growing debts, to the fantastical she found something in Grimshaw Woods or was found by something that transcends common sense. The severe uneasiness that appears to afflict individuals who examine the case too thoroughly is what unites these many opinions. A trend of intellectual endeavor giving way to psychological suffering can be seen in everything from Dr. Caldwell's unsettling last remarks to Richard Harmon's sudden decision to stop his research to the alarming incident involving archivist Michael Collins. When asked about the situation, Dr. James Thornton, a psychiatrist who specializes in folie à deux and other related psychological problems, provided this viewpoint. What we may be observing is a kind of contagious narrative. A story so effectively structured, so perfectly calibrated to activate certain cognitive and emotional responses, that it creates a kind of psychological resonance in those exposed to it. Mrs. Blackwood's diary, assuming she was indeed suffering from a delusional disorder, represents 30 years of a mind refining and perfecting this narrative. It's not surprising that it might affect susceptible individuals who immerse themselves in it. When asked if he would enjoy studying the notebook himself, Dr. Thornton declined. "Some risks," he stated, "aren't worth taking, even in pursuit of understanding." Occasionally, people interested in the case visit the original farmhouse site, which is now only an overgrown depression in the ground where the foundation once stood. Several times a year, especially during the anniversaries of Elijah's passing and Eliza's disappearance, local police report having to remove amateur paranormal investigators. 5 college students who were camping close to the location as part of a self-described paranormal challenge all had the same vivid dream in June 2018, which was an especially odd occurrence. They claimed to have been going through a strange property when they became conscious of something they couldn't quite see, watching them from doorways and corners. Before daybreak, all 5 of them left their camp, leaving behind their equipment in their eagerness to leave. Millbrook itself is still slowly deteriorating. Only 87 people were counted in the 2020 census, the majority of whom were elderly. In 2013, the post office closed. A minister who travels from Jefferson City leads the Presbyterian Church's monthly services. The general store's main sources of income are the packaged items and gas it sells to passing motorists on the state highway. However, a remnant of the Blackwood tale endures in the local communal consciousness. She is still spoken in whispers by the elderly, who call her the widow's curse when bad things happen. On some nights, especially when mist rises from the Osage River and filters through the trees, residents report seeing lights moving among the ancient oaks, lights that follow no path, cast no reflection, and disappear when approached. Parents also caution children not to go near Grimshaw Woods after dark. There is still no conclusive explanation for the case of Eliza Blackwood, the diligent widow who chronicled her own decline into either wickedness, madness, or something beyond the realm of common sense. A diary full of implausible claims, a mansion that refused to take residents, a woman who disappeared without a trace, and a persistent uneasiness that descends upon everyone who digs too far into the narrative are all that are left. Dr. Caldwell's concluding remarks raise the perhaps most unsettling possibility that Eliza Blackwood's 30-year project, whatever its actual nature, continued after her disappearance in 1922. Even decades later, the thing she started is still going strong, affecting people as it spreads across time like ripples in still water. Ultimately, it's possible that Eliza Blackwood's most unsettling legacy was not that she came upon something unnatural, but rather that she accepted, nurtured, and eventually cherished it, one meticulous journal entry at a time. She may have opened a door that has never completely closed in the process. As this story comes to an end, early in 2023, a last piece of the Blackwood puzzle was discovered. An archivist found a little envelope hidden between the pages of an unrelated collection of Miller County agricultural records during a routine inventory of uncatalogued objects at the Missouri Historical Society. An undated photograph that was obviously from the early 20th century based on its composition and developing techniques was found within. A woman is seen in the picture standing at the edge of a forested area, staring into the trees with her back to the camera. Her hair is styled to resemble clothing from the 1910 seconds or early 1920 seconds, and she is dressed in a dark, period-appropriate attire. The handwritten note on the reverse of the photograph is what makes it noteworthy. E.B. Final day. She did not know I followed. She did not return. The initials at the bottom of the note, J.W., correspond to those of Deputy James Winters, who was involved in the initial investigation into Eliza Blackwood's disappearance. This photograph, if genuine, might be the last known picture of Eliza Blackwood. It was shot on or around the 11th of June, 1922, which is when her diary's last entry was made. It implies that on the day Mrs. Blackwood disappeared, Deputy Winters had followed her into Grimshaw Woods, possibly out of self-interest or initiative. It's unclear why he didn't bring this up in official reports. Maybe he saw something he didn't want to admit or couldn't explain. Or maybe, as his daughter subsequently proposed, some events defy official documentation because they make us reevaluate what is possible. Although the photograph's provenance and subject identity cannot be definitively confirmed, it has been authenticated as being in line with historical photographing procedures. Like a lot of the Blackwood case, it is still a fascinating piece that begs more questions than it answers. As a result, Eliza Blackwood's story has endured over the years. A whisper barely audible, a movement hardly visible, a mystery that begs for exploration but cautions against focusing too intently or for too long. A question remains for many who read her story. Was Eliza Blackwood a victim of mental illness, bereavement, or something more sinister? Or was she the mastermind behind a mystery that still has an impact a century after she entered Grimshaw Woods and disappeared from the pages of history in her deliberate, patient manner? In that package addressed to the Missouri Historical Society in October 1922, she is credited with saying, "The circle is complete. What was divided is now whole. Do not look for me in places where time still moves forward." This may be the most accurate response. The story serves as a reminder of how flimsy the facade of normalcy can be and how easily it can be ruptured by forces beyond our comprehension. Regardless of what actually occurred in that farmhouse by the woods, or what Eliza Blackwood wrote in her diary during those 30 patient years, occasionally, the most dangerous creatures are not those that burst through our doors, but rather those that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be invited inside. Furthermore, it's possible that some doors can never be fully closed after they've been opened.